The day I found out my two children cared more about teaching me a lesson than keeping me alive, I was standing in the pharmacy holding a prescription I couldn't afford. The pharmacist had already scanned the medication and quietly turned the screen toward me with the total. I looked at the number for several long seconds before asking her to cancel the order. She didn't seem surprised. In fact, she gave me the kind of sympathetic smile that told me she had watched the exact same scene play out with dozens of other retirees. I thanked her, folded the prescription, slipped it back into my jacket pocket, and walked out into the chilly October afternoon pretending that I'd simply changed my mind. I hadn't. I just wasn't about to spend my last $200 on medication when my utility bill was due 3 days later. Growing old teaches you something people rarely talk about. Eventually, life becomes an endless series of decisions about which problem deserves your money more than the others. As I drove home, I kept thinking about how different everything had become. 10 years earlier, I owned a successful construction company outside Columbus, Ohio. The business wasn't enormous, but it was stable, respected, and profitable enough that my wife, Linda, and I never worried about paying bills. We worked hard, raised 2 children, paid off our home, and genuinely believed that if we treated people well, life would eventually return the favor. Then Linda got sick. Cancer doesn't just attack a person's body. It slowly dismantles every plan you've ever made together. Over 3 years, we emptied retirement accounts, refinanced the house, sold equipment from the business, and borrowed against nearly everything we owned, trying to buy more time. If I had been offered another year with my wife in exchange for every dollar I'd ever earned, I would have signed the papers without reading them. In the end, I lost both. After Linda passed away, I sold the company because I no longer had the energy to run it alone. Between medical expenses and taxes, there wasn't nearly as much money left as people assumed. I purchased a modest 1-story house, invested what remained as carefully as I could, and settled into the quiet life everyone insisted I had earned. At least that was the plan. Life has a strange habit of laughing at plans. Over the following few years, my children seemed to develop an incredible talent for finding financial emergencies. First, it was my son, Ethan. His landscaping business was supposedly going through a temporary cash flow problem, and the bank was threatening to freeze one of his commercial accounts. He promised he only needed $25,000 for a month or two until several large invoices were paid. I transferred the money that same afternoon. He hugged me, thanked me repeatedly, and promised I would have every cent back before summer. That repayment never came. Several months later, my daughter, Rebecca, called in tears. She explained that she had fallen behind on mortgage payments after her husband lost his job, and if they couldn't catch up immediately, they might lose the house where my 2 granddaughters had grown up. I didn't hesitate. Family helps family. At least that's what I had spent my entire life believing. Over the next 3 years, there were more emergencies than I could count. A business loan, unexpected tax bills, a failed investment, home repairs after storm damage, private school tuition, car repairs, medical expenses. Every time one of my children called, I found a way to help. Sometimes it meant selling investments earlier than I wanted. Sometimes it meant withdrawing money from retirement savings. Sometimes it meant convincing myself that living a little more modestly wasn't really a sacrifice if it helped my family stay on their feet. I never kept score. Parents aren't supposed to. My late wife used to tell me that generosity only becomes meaningful when you expect nothing in return. I believe that with my whole heart. Looking back now, maybe I believed it a little too much. The first time I realized something had changed between us happened on my 72nd birthday. Rebecca texted me at almost 9 o'clock that evening, saying she had completely forgotten because work had been hectic. Ethan didn't call at all. The only person who knocked on my front door that day was my grandson, Noah. He showed up carrying a chocolate cake that looked slightly crooked, a grocery store birthday card, and a bag containing 2 steaks. I figured Grandma would have wanted us to grill tonight, he said with an awkward smile. Neither of us mentioned the empty driveway. Neither of us mentioned the silence from the rest of the family. We simply cooked dinner together and spent the evening talking about college, football, and the old fishing trips I used to take him on every summer. When he left that night, I remember thinking something that made me feel guilty. If one person remembered, maybe that was enough. Over the following year, Noah became the family member I spoke with most often. He called every few days just to check how I was doing. Sometimes he asked if I wanted company while he studied for exams. Other times, he simply stopped by after work with takeout because he knew eating alone every night wasn't much fun. He never asked me for money. Not once. If anything, he often insisted on paying for lunch himself, even though I knew he was working 2 part-time jobs just to cover tuition and rent. One afternoon, I quietly asked why he kept trying to pay. He looked genuinely confused by the question. "Because you're my grandpa," he answered. "You've spent my whole life taking care of everyone else. Let me buy you a burger once in a while." It wasn't the money. It never was. It was the fact that someone still thought about me before thinking about what I could do for them. About 6 months later, something happened that changed everything. I was sitting in my living room watching the evening news when 6 numbers appeared on the television screen. For a few seconds, I simply stared. Then I looked down at the lottery tickets sitting on the coffee table, then back at the television, then back at the ticket. I checked the numbers again, and again. Then I drove to the convenience store because I was convinced I had somehow read them incorrectly. The cashier scanned the ticket, looked at the screen, and immediately stopped smiling. Without saying a word, she disappeared into the manager's office. A minute later, the manager walked out, looking just as stunned. He politely explained that they couldn't process the ticket there because the amount exceeded anything the store was authorized to pay. I thanked him, folded the ticket, and walked back to my truck in complete silence. The following morning, after several meetings with lottery officials, accountants, and an attorney named Daniel Brooks, my life changed forever. After taxes, trusts, and every legal document had been finalized, I was worth a little over $300 million. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't purchase a yacht. I didn't tell my children. Instead, I decided to find out whether they would still care about me if they believed I had nothing left to give. For the next 3 weeks, I told absolutely no one about the lottery. Not Ethan. Not Rebecca. Not even Noah. The only people who knew were my attorney, Daniel Brooks, a financial advisor his firm recommended, and the State Lottery Commission. Daniel insisted that the first few months after receiving that kind of money would determine whether I enjoyed the rest of my life or spent it surrounded by lawsuits, fake friends, and relatives who suddenly remembered my birthday. He wasn't exaggerating. Every meeting began with another story about someone whose fortune disappeared because they trusted the wrong people. By the end of the third week, nearly every dollar had already been placed inside carefully structured trusts and investment accounts. The money was protected, anonymous wherever possible, and legally separated in ways I barely understood. Daniel understood them perfectly. Now, he said as we finished signing the last stack of documents, you can start deciding what kind of life you actually want. I thought about that question all the way home. For nearly 40 years, every important decision I made had revolved around someone else. My wife, my children, my employees, my grandchildren. For the first time since I was in my 20s, I had complete freedom. Oddly enough, the first thing I wanted wasn't luxury. I wanted certainty. I wanted to know whether the people closest to me actually cared about me, or whether they only cared about what I could provide. The idea stayed in my head for several days before I finally mentioned it to Daniel. He leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. You already know the answer, don't you? I hope I don't. But you suspect. I nodded. I've spent years convincing myself they're just busy. And are they? I honestly don't know anymore. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened one of the folders sitting on his desk. What if, he asked, you stopped being the person everyone depends on? What do you mean? What happens if, for once, you're the one asking for help instead of giving it? The room became very quiet. It sounded simple, almost too simple. I don't want to manipulate anybody. You wouldn't be manipulating them. He folded his hands. You'd simply be giving them an opportunity to make their own choice. That sentence stayed with me. An opportunity to make their own choice. Nobody would be forced to help me. Nobody would even know there was a test. They would simply respond the way they genuinely wanted to respond. A week later, the opportunity arrived naturally. During my annual physical, my doctor adjusted one of my prescriptions and casually mentioned that some insurance companies no longer covered the medication as generously as before. Walking back to my truck, I suddenly realized I had the perfect reason. It was believable, ordinary, and impossible to verify without asking me directly. That evening, I called Ethan first. He answered after the fourth ring. Dad, everything okay? I hope so. What happened? I explained that my prescription had become unexpectedly expensive and that I was running short until my pension payment arrived the following week. Then I asked whether he could lend me $200 for a few days. Silence. Not shocked silence. Annoyed silence. Finally, he sighed. Dad, you're retired. I know. You really need to start planning better. I didn't interrupt. He continued explaining that money had been tight ever since he expanded his business. Payroll costs were higher than expected. Equipment payments kept increasing, and every extra dollar already had a purpose. I'd help if I could. I looked through the front window at the brand new pickup truck sitting in his driveway. It still had temporary license plates. I understand. I'm serious. I know. We'll figure something out. Of course. The call ended less than a minute later. He never asked whether I would be able to buy the medication. He never asked if I was feeling all right. He simply moved on. I told myself not to judge too quickly. Everyone has difficult weeks. Maybe Rebecca's response would be different. The following afternoon, I called her while she was driving home from work. She sounded distracted almost immediately. Dad, can I call you back? It'll only take a minute. I explained the same situation, the same prescription, The same $200. For several seconds, she didn't answer. Then she laughed. Not loudly. Just enough to let me know she thought the request was ridiculous. Dad. Seriously? What? You've always been terrible with money. That sentence genuinely surprised me. I had spent decades paying for birthdays, family vacations, weddings, emergencies, and college expenses. Yet somehow, I was the irresponsible one. I only need help until next Friday. You really should have an emergency fund. I used to. What happened to it? Years of helping family. I almost said the words. Instead, I remained quiet. Rebecca kept talking. There are financial planning classes for seniors, you know. You can't keep expecting everyone else to solve your problems. I've never expected that. Haven't you? The conversation ended a few minutes later after she promised to send me information about budgeting workshops instead of the money. Not once did she ask whether I had taken my medication. Not once. I sat in my living room for almost an hour afterward, wondering whether I had been unfair. Maybe 2 conversations weren't enough. Maybe circumstances really had been bad. Maybe I was reading too much into everything. Then my phone rang. It was Noah. Grandpa, Dad mentioned you weren't feeling well. I'll be all right. What's going on? I gave him exactly the same explanation. Nothing more. Nothing less. Before I even finished speaking, he interrupted. How much do you need? $200. That's it? I'll pay you back next week. He actually sounded confused. Grandpa, why are you talking about paying me back? It's your money. So? I smiled despite myself. I don't want to cause problems. You've been solving everyone else's problems my whole life. He paused briefly. I've got about $600 left after rent. You need that. So do you. Noah. I'm transferring it right now. You don't even know if I'm telling the truth. His answer is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. If my grandfather says he needs help buying medicine, I don't need proof. Less than 30 seconds later, my phone buzzed. $600 received. Every dollar he had left for the month. I stared at the notification for a long time. Not because of the money, because a 20-year-old college student working evenings at a grocery store had shown me more compassion in 2 minutes than my own children had managed in years. At that moment, the test was over. I already knew exactly what I was going to do with $300 million. For the first time in many years, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed anymore. Sitting alone in my living room with my phone still resting on the coffee table, I realized the test had already given me every answer I needed. Neither Ethan nor Rebecca had known about the lottery. Neither of them believed I had anything left to offer financially. As far as they were concerned, I was simply an aging widower asking his children for a small favor because he couldn't afford medication. And both of them had decided that $200 was too much to sacrifice. Noah, on the other hand, had emptied nearly his entire checking account without asking for proof, conditions, or promises. Money has an interesting way of revealing character. Not because wealthy people are automatically generous, but because financial decisions force people to choose what they truly value. The following morning, I met Daniel Brooks for breakfast. He noticed my expression before I even sat down. You know, I do. He nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. What happens now? I keep my promise. Daniel smiled slightly. I thought you might say that. Over the next several days, we completely revised the estate plan we had drafted only a few weeks earlier. Originally, I had intended to divide everything equally between Ethan and Rebecca, while setting aside a smaller educational trust for Noah and my 2 granddaughters. That document no longer reflected reality. Instead, Daniel created an entirely new structure. The majority of my estate would eventually pass to Noah through a protected trust that couldn't be challenged easily in court. Funds were also reserved for charitable organizations supporting cancer research, something Linda would have appreciated more than any luxury purchase I could imagine. As for my children, Daniel looked at me before writing the final instructions. Are you absolutely certain? I've never been more certain. They're going to be furious. They're already disappointed in me for asking for $200. He couldn't argue with that. About 2 weeks later, I called Noah. I asked if he wanted to spend Saturday together. He arrived expecting another afternoon of grilling burgers and watching football. Instead, I handed him the keys to a brand new dark blue Toyota Camry parked in my driveway. He stared at them for several seconds before looking back at me. What are these for? It's yours. He laughed because he genuinely thought I was joking. Grandpa, seriously. I'm completely serious. His smile slowly disappeared. You bought me a car? You've been driving that old sedan since high school. It still runs. Barely. He looked at the car again before shaking his head. I can't accept something like this. You accepted giving your grandfather every dollar you had without thinking twice. That's different. No. I placed the keys back into his hand. It's exactly the same. He hugged me so hard I thought he might crack one of my ribs. He kept thanking me over and over while I simply smiled, knowing this was only the beginning. Unfortunately, expensive surprises rarely remain secret for very long. 3 days later, Ethan's black BMW pulled into my driveway almost at the same time Rebecca's white Lexus stopped behind it. Neither of them called beforehand. Neither of them knocked. They walked straight into the backyard where Noah was washing his new car, with the excitement only a young man receiving his first brand new vehicle could have. Ethan frowned immediately. "Whose car is that?" Noah smiled proudly. "Mine." Rebecca looked confused. "Since when?" "Grandpa surprised me." Both of them turned toward me at exactly the same time. I could almost see the calculations happening inside their heads. Only a few days earlier, I supposedly couldn't afford medication. Now I was buying new cars. Ethan spoke first. "Dad." Inside. "We need to talk." His tone wasn't curious. It was demanding. A few minutes later, all four of us were sitting around my dining room table. The same table where Linda and I had celebrated birthdays, helped with homework, planned family vacations, and believed we were raising children who would someday look after one another. Ethan folded his arms. "Where did the money come from?" "I had some savings." Rebecca leaned forward. "Last week you were asking us for medication money. This week you're buying a $30,000 car. Something isn't adding up." I remained completely calm. Was I asking for money? They exchanged confused looks. I thought I was asking my children for help. Rebecca sighed impatiently. "Please don't play word games." "I'm not." Ethan's voice became noticeably sharper. "If you're hiding something from us, now would be a good time to explain." I looked at both of them for several long seconds before quietly answering. I decided not to buy the medication. Rebecca's expression changed instantly. "What?" I figured Noah needed reliable transportation more than I needed another prescription. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan stood so quickly his chair scraped across the hardwood floor. "That's insane. You can't just stop taking medication." "Oh?" I looked directly at him. "Now you're concerned about my health?" "Dad, this isn't funny." I agree. The room became completely silent. I walked into my office, returned carrying a thick blue folder, and placed it in front of Ethan. "Let's talk about money." He opened the folder. Inside were copies of bank transfers, canceled checks, wire confirmations, and handwritten notes I had kept over the years. Every single time I had helped them financially. Every dollar. Every date. I pointed toward the first page. April 3 years ago. "You needed $22,000 because your business couldn't make payroll." He swallowed. I turned another page. 7 months later. "Rebecca, your mortgage was nearly 90 days behind." Another page. "Ethan, credit card debt." Another. "Rebecca, property taxes." Another. "Your kitchen renovation." Another. "Your boat loan." Another. "The emergency roof repairs." Page after page after page. Neither of them interrupted. Neither of them denied any of it. Finally, I closed the folder. "Do you know how much money I gave the two of you over the last 4 years?" Silence. "A little over $150,000. I folded my hands on the table. Not loans. Not investments. Gifts. Because every single time you promised to pay me back, I told you not to worry about it. Neither of them could even look me in the eye anymore." Just then, Noah quietly stepped into the kitchen after realizing the conversation had become much more serious than any of us expected. He looked from me to his father and aunt before asking the one question neither of them wanted to hear. "So, when Grandpa needed $200, and why didn't either of you help him?" Nobody answered. The silence said everything. I reached into the folder one last time and placed a single envelope in front of Noah. "Go ahead." He opened it carefully. Inside was a photocopy of a lottery ticket along with several legal documents. At first, he looked confused. Then his eyes widened. He checked the numbers once. Then again. Finally, he looked at me with complete disbelief. "Grandpa," and this says, I smiled. "Yes, I won." His voice barely came out above a whisper. $331 million. Ethan's face lost every trace of color. Rebecca slowly lowered herself back into her chair as though her legs had suddenly stopped working. For several long seconds, nobody in the room said a single word.